Imagine waking up one day to realize that your entire life has been scripted, not by fate, not by divine intervention, but by a carefully constructed system of influence that you never truly consented to. You walk into the office, coffee in hand, smiling at your colleagues, nodding to your manager, logging in to your computer. Everything feels routine, ordinary, safe. Yet beneath the surface, invisible strings are being pulled, and you were not the one holding them. What if the company you devote your hours, your effort, your very identity to, functions not unlike a cult? Not the kind with strange robes, candlelit rituals, or charismatic gurus whispering promises of salvation, but a modern, polished, corporate cult led by individuals in suits and ties, CEOs, founders, and executives who, without your awareness, employ the same psychological levers cult leaders have mastered for centuries. The unsettling truth is this: the corporate world, dressed in professionalism and productivity metrics, borrows from the same playbook that has kept followers loyal to cults, dictators, and religious zealots throughout history. You may think you're free, making choices based on your own desires, but ask yourself, who benefits from your choices? Who designed the environment where your decisions are made? Who decides what is rewarded, what is punished, and what is left unsaid? Consider the language of devotion companies quietly demand. We're a family here. Sacrifice today for tomorrow's vision. Be a believer in our mission. At first, it sounds inspiring, almost noble. But pause for a moment. When did employment transform into faith? When did work shift from a transaction of labor for pay into an act of worship, where your loyalty and identity are measured as much as your output? And what happens when someone questions the mission? When they resist the rituals of endless meetings, performance reviews, motivational speeches, and corporate retreats that feel more like indoctrination than collaboration? Look around. Are the doubters celebrated as free thinkers, or are they quietly shamed, excluded, labeled as not a cultural fit? Here lies the paradox. The workplace promises you independence, empowerment, and professional growth, yet the very structure designed to empower you is often a machine engineered to erode autonomy, foster dependency, and keep you loyal not to yourself, but to the system. You were told you were free, but your freedom is framed, monitored, and rewarded only within strict boundaries. What if the corporate ladder is less a path to personal success and more a staircase leading deeper into controlled conformity? What if the motivational slogans plastered on walls and echoed in emails aren't about your growth at all, but about ensuring obedience disguised as ambition? Think of the great cult leaders of the past. They rarely controlled their followers with chains or cages. Instead, they offered purpose, belonging, identity. They convinced people that they were part of something larger, something transcendent. Isn't that the same promise whispered by corporations? Join us and you'll find meaning. You'll change the world. You'll be part of history. And yet, if you strip away the slogans and branding, how different is the dynamic? Followers surrender individuality for belonging. Members sacrifice autonomy for a higher cause. Outsiders are dismissed as unfaithful, unbelievers. The structure isolates, rewards conformity, and punishes dissent. So ask yourself, when you commit to your company's mission, are you chasing your own dream or living inside someone else's carefully engineered illusion? When you sacrifice hours of your life to the vision, whose vision is it really? The more you think about it, the harder it becomes to separate corporate culture from cult tactics. Both thrive on psychological manipulation, repetition, Indoctrination, peer pressure, the slow erosion of individuality. Both depend on creating insiders and outsiders. Both feed on the most primal human needs: belonging, purpose, identity, and security. Here is the great question that will haunt the edges of your thoughts. If modern corporations are the new cults and CEOs the modern-day high priests, how much of your life have you already surrendered without ever noticing? This is where the real story begins, not with accusations or conspiracy, but with a challenge to perception. Because once you start to see the machinery behind the curtain, once you notice the tactics that have always been there, you cannot unsee them. And the question becomes, will you keep playing your part, or will you finally recognize the stage for what it really is? The unsettling realization that corporations operate like modern cults is not just poetic exaggeration, it is rooted in centuries of psychological insight and philosophical warnings. When Carl Jung wrote about the shadow, he wasn't only speaking of individuals, but of collective systems. Jung believed that anything suppressed, denied, or hidden eventually reemerges in darker, more destructive forms. Now imagine the shadow of an entire corporation. Its greed, its lust for power, its denial of human limits, masked behind smiling HR campaigns and polished vision statements. That shadow does not simply vanish. It is managed, hidden, projected onto employees who are told to embody resilience, hustle, grit, while the system itself remains unquestioned. Why does this matter? Because at the core of both cults and corporations lies the same psychological blueprint, a need to control identity. Once you control identity, you no longer need to force obedience. Obedience becomes voluntary, even enthusiastic. Friedrich Nietzsche warned of this when he observed that humans will endure almost any suffering if they believe it serves a higher purpose. A corporation that convinces you your late nights, missed family dinners, and eroded health are all for the mission has already secured your devotion. You don't think you're sacrificing yourself, you think you're fulfilling destiny. Arthur Schopenhauer, the master pessimist, wrote that human beings are driven not by reason, but by blind, insatiable will. Companies exploit this by framing endless growth as a virtue, even though growth for growth's sake often destroys the individual. The quarterly targets must rise, the profits must expand, the stock must climb. And employees, internalizing this will to grow, find themselves restless even in success, chasing the next milestone, the next promotion, the next applause from leadership. The system's hunger becomes their hunger. But hunger alone is not enough. To maintain control, corporations borrow from the Machiavellian playbook. Machiavelli advised rulers to appear virtuous while pursuing power with ruthless pragmatism. CEOs do the same. The language of empathy, family, and shared mission cloaks the reality of extraction. We value work-life balance, they say, while praising those who sacrifice balance for the job. We are transparent, they assure, while quietly hiding the deepest financial truths. The virtue is public. The will to dominate is private. Think of Jean-Paul Sartre's concept of bad faith, the way humans lie to themselves to avoid responsibility for their freedom. In corporate structures, bad faith takes on an institutional form. The employee tells themselves, "I'm free to leave any time." Yet the truth is not so simple. Social ties, financial dependency, professional identity all tether them like invisible chains. Just as cult members can technically walk away, the psychological weight of leaving often feels unbearable. Your paycheck is not just money, it is survival. Your title is not just a role, it is self-worth. The cage is invisible, but it is no less a cage. Aldous Huxley warned in Brave New World that the most effective form of tyranny is not pain, but pleasure. The creation of a system where people are distracted, entertained, and made to love their servitude. In corporations, this appears in the perks, the shiny offices, the free lunches, the gym memberships. It looks like generosity, but it serves the same end as the cult's chanting rituals, distraction from the deeper reality that your autonomy is being bartered away. You don't resist because part of you enjoys the gilded cage. Even Viktor Frankl, who found meaning in the face of suffering, would caution us here. Meaning can liberate, but it can also enslave if the meaning is imposed rather than chosen. When your company defines meaning for you, this is your purpose, your family, your destiny. It hijacks your most sacred psychological need. To question the mission becomes to question your own reason for living. What greater prison could exist than one disguised as ultimate freedom? Yet here is where the problem grows darker. Most people never recognize this manipulation because it does not feel like manipulation. It feels like choice. You apply for the job. You sign the contract. You nod in agreement during the company retreat. No one is forcing you, at least not visibly. But choice itself has been shaped by the environment, by subtle pressures, by the carefully engineered belief that success and belonging only exist within the system. It is not that you are chained, it is that the walls have been painted to look like open sky. This is why questioning feels so dangerous. The cult thrives on silence, and the corporation thrives on conformity. To doubt too loudly is to risk exile, not in the desert, but in unemployment, in the quiet humiliation of being deemed unfit, disloyal, or resistant to the culture. And so the majority conform, not out of malice, but out of survival. If you look closely, you begin to see the parallels everywhere. The daily stand-up meeting becomes a ritual of devotion. The quarterly results call is the sermon, delivered by the CEO priest in carefully rehearsed tones. The mission statement is scripture, repeated endlessly until it takes root in the subconscious. The reward of promotions and bonuses is the promise of salvation. The fear of layoffs is eternal damnation.
And yet, like Jung's shadow, these tactics remain hidden in plain sight, denied by those who practice them. Leaders insist they are building culture, not control. Employees tell themselves they are advancing careers, not surrendering identities. But underneath the glossy language, the same dynamic repeats. Power consolidates at the top. Loyalty is demanded at the bottom, and individuality is slowly consumed in the fire of collective devotion. The question now is no longer, is this real? Because it is. The deeper question is, what are the consequences of living inside such a system, day after day, year after year? What happens to a society where work becomes worship, and CEOs become the high priests of modern devotion? If the modern corporation functions like a cult, the most chilling truth is not in its structure, but in its effects. For consequences are rarely immediate. They unfold quietly, slowly, like poison dissolved in water. You drink it daily, convinced it sustains you, until one day you realize it has reshaped your mind, your identity, your very sense of what it means to be free. At the personal level, the first consequence is erosion of the self. When your identity fuses with your company's mission, you cease to exist independently. Ask yourself, who are you outside of your job title? For many, the answer is silence. Work becomes the anchor of selfhood, so that losing it feels like death. A cult follower struggles when cut off from the group, An employee laid off after years of devotion feels the same existential void. The job was never just a job. It was meaning. And when meaning is outsourced, the soul becomes dependent on forces beyond its control. This dependence warps time itself. Cult members mark their days with rituals. Employees do the same, though in subtler ways. The Monday meeting, the Friday deadline, the fiscal quarter, all become sacred calendars. Life outside the office begins to feel like filler, an intermission between the real moments that occur at work. Weekends blur into preparation for Monday. Vacations carry the guilt of absence. Time no longer belongs to you. It belongs to the system. Then comes the erosion of freedom of thought. A person immersed in a corporate culture rarely notices how their inner voice shifts. Words once personal become slogans, disruptive, innovative, scalable. Even dissent is framed in corporate jargon, reduced to terms safe for the system to process. True rebellion becomes unthinkable, not because it is forbidden, but because the very concepts to describe it have been erased from your vocabulary. George Orwell once warned that control of language is control of thought. In boardrooms and Slack channels, the prophecy lives on. But perhaps the deepest consequence is psychological dependency on fear and reward cycles. The brain is wired by dopamine, the same neurotransmitter that traps gamblers at slot machines and cult members in rituals. Corporations exploit this neural loop with frightening precision. The dangling of promotions, performance bonuses, Employee of the Month awards creates a feedback loop. Chase reward, receive dopamine, crave more. On the flip side, fear of layoffs, demotions, or exclusion from the culture triggers cortisol, the stress hormone, which drives obedience. A perfect Pavlovian cage, hope and fear alternating in rhythm until resistance feels impossible. At the societal level, the consequences grow even darker. A population trained in corporate obedience becomes a population less likely to question authority anywhere else. If you accept manipulation in your workplace, how easily do you accept it in politics, in media, in religion? When obedience is normalized, conformity becomes a civic virtue, and dissent is cast as disruption. Whole societies begin to resemble cults, not through violent coercion, but through quiet conditioning. Look around and you'll see it. Nations where citizens cheerfully surrender privacy in exchange for convenience, just as employees surrender autonomy in exchange for a paycheck. Cults thrive on binary thinking, with us or against us. So too does the corporate political nexus. Loyal employees versus disloyal ones, patriots versus traitors, believers versus doubters. In every domain, the line between work and worship, between governance and indoctrination, blurs. Nietzsche once asked, "What if truth is just another illusion?" In the corporate cult, truth is indeed relative. Success metrics, KPIs, quarterly goals, all constructed realities. If the numbers say the company is thriving, then it is, regardless of how hollow or destructive its practices may be. Employees are taught to believe the numbers as scripture, even if their lived experience whispers otherwise. Over time, the ability to trust one's own perception atrophies. You stop asking, "Does this feel right?" and instead ask, "Does this align with the data?" Reality itself becomes mediated by metrics. And what of the human spirit under such conditions? Sartre argued that bad faith, Self-deception rots authenticity from within. When employees tell themselves, "I choose this," while knowing in some corner of their heart they do not, they fracture. The self splits into the compliant persona and the silenced rebel. Over years, the rebel dies. What remains is a hollow person who can recite company values but no longer remembers their own. The physical body does not escape unscathed either. Chronic stress, suppressed individuality, constant comparison all take their toll. Burnout is not just exhaustion, it is the psychic scream of a soul denied autonomy. Like cult members who starve, self-harm, or collapse under strain, employees, too, find themselves breaking down. Anxiety, depression, insomnia, these are not personal failures, but systemic consequences of environments designed to push humans beyond their limits. And yet, despite the suffering, escape is rare. Why? Because the system rewards complicity with status. Climbing the corporate ladder mirrors climbing the cult hierarchy. Each promotion, each new title feels like liberation, but in reality, it binds you deeper. The higher you go, the harder it is to leave. Leaders at the top may even forget the chains entirely, mistaking control for freedom. The prisoner becomes the warden, repeating the cycle to the next generation. This is the cruelest consequence of all, the normalization of control. When control becomes invisible, it ceases to be questioned. A cult member doesn't ask why they bow to their leader, they simply do. An employee doesn't ask why they sacrifice decades for a vision not their own, they simply do. The machinery runs smoothly until one day the individual awakes with the terrifying thought, "Was any of this truly mine?" Here is where the emotional urgency sharpens. You may already sense that you are caught in this invisible web, that your dreams, your sense of self, your very reality have been subtly shaped. The rituals you thought were harmless, the loyalty you thought was choice, the meaning you thought was yours, perhaps none of it was. The question now is inescapable. If corporations shape not just our labor, but our souls, what does it mean to truly break free? Breaking free from the corporate cult is not as simple as quitting your job or walking away from the office. Just as cult survivors know, leaving physically is only half the battle. The more insidious chains are psychological, the beliefs, habits, and fears embedded deep within you. Liberation begins not with an external act, but with an internal rebellion. The refusal to let others define your meaning. But how does one rebel against a system that feels as natural as breathing? The first step is recognition. You must learn to see the invisible architecture of control around you. This is shadow work in the Jungian sense, dragging into light what has long been hidden. Jung argued that freedom requires confronting the unconscious forces that drive us. In the corporate context, this means asking uncomfortable questions. Why do I seek validation from titles? Why does losing a job terrify me more than losing my health? Why do I equate productivity with self-worth? Each question peels back a layer of indoctrination until you begin to see how much of you has been constructed by the system. Nietzsche would urge you to go further. He spoke of the need to revalue all values, to destroy inherited truths and rebuild them anew. Corporate culture thrives on unquestioned values: efficiency, growth, loyalty, hustle. But what if these are not universal goods? What if they are tools designed to keep you docile? To rebel, you must dare to create your own values, even if they contradict the system. Perhaps slowness is more sacred than speed. Perhaps loyalty to self is nobler than loyalty to a brand. Perhaps true growth is not measured in revenue, but in depth of experience. Once recognition takes hold, the next step is detachment. This does not mean neglecting responsibility or refusing to work. Rather, it is a conscious uncoupling of identity from employment. You are not your job. You are not your performance review. You are not your quarterly metrics. Repeat this until it sinks into your bones. The corporation thrives by fusing your self-worth with your output. Break the link, and suddenly their greatest weapon, the power to shame and praise, loses force. Consider Schopenhauer's counsel. Suffering intensifies when we tie our happiness to external conditions. Detachment is the refusal to hand your joy over to the marketplace. It is the radical act of finding meaning that no CEO, no system, no title can give or take away. But rebellion cannot remain internal forever. It demands action, even if subtle. Sartre insisted that freedom is not something you wait for, it is something you live. Each choice you make either affirms your autonomy or surrenders it. Perhaps rebellion looks like setting hard boundaries with your time, refusing to glorify burnout. Perhaps it looks like questioning slogans out loud, planting seeds of doubt in colleagues. Perhaps it looks like building projects, communities, or creative pursuits that exist outside corporate control. Realities where your worth is not tied to output. At first, these acts may feel small, even trivial. But remember, cults unravel when doubt spreads. The most dangerous weapon against control is not violence, but the whisper of another way to live. And there is precedent for this. History is filled with those who broke free from invisible prisons. Dostoevsky, imprisoned in Siberia, found liberation not in escape, but in the reclamation of inner freedom. Frankl, surviving the camps, discovered that meaning chosen freely cannot be stripped away. Even Machiavelli, often misread as cynical, hinted at the necessity of cunning resistance when the powerful manipulate appearances. The lesson is clear. Freedom is not given, it is seized. Still, rebellion is not without cost. You may face resistance, isolation, even ridicule. A cult rejects those who question the leader. A corporation resists those who refuse to conform. But here lies the paradox of power. When you stop fearing exclusion, exclusion loses its sting. Once you stand rooted in meaning that cannot be taken, you become untouchable. The very system that sought to control you begins to lose its grip. And with this loss of grip comes clarity. You begin to see the cracks in the edifice. The CEO's speech no longer feels divine, it sounds rehearsed. The mission statement no longer feels sacred, it feels like marketing. The rituals no longer feel inspiring, they feel hollow. What once held you captive now reveals itself as fragile theater. But rebellion is not simply about escaping one cage only to fall into another. True liberation requires a deeper step, constructing a life on your own terms. This means asking the question most people avoid. If I was not bound by expectation, What would I choose? Few dare answer honestly, for the answer often demands sacrifice, uncertainty, risk. Yet this is the cost of freedom. As Nietzsche said, one must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. Rebellion, then, is not destruction for its own sake. It is creation. The creation of a self no longer dependent on the applause of leaders or the comfort of systems. It is a life where work is chosen, not worshipped, where meaning is self-authored, not pre-packaged, where belonging is found in authentic connection, not manufactured loyalty. And this rebellion, once begun, cannot be stopped. It spreads inward, rewriting your relationship to yourself, and outward, inspiring others to question, to detach, to reclaim. One act of authenticity becomes contagious. One refusal to play the game becomes a quiet revolution. The system may continue, as cults and corporations always do. But for you, the illusion will be shattered. You will walk among them no longer as a follower, but as a free being, unmasked, unchained.
And then comes the final step. Not just rebellion, but realization. The ultimate truth that reframes everything. After all the questioning, the doubt, the rebellion, what remains? If cults and corporations alike thrive on control, then true freedom must come from piercing the illusion at its core. And here is the unsettling revelation. The prison you believed yourself trapped in was never locked. Think about it. The system never truly chained your body. It chained your perception. It did not bar the exits, it convinced you the exits didn't exist. Like Plato's prisoners in the cave, you stared at shadows and mistook them for reality. The walls were painted by propaganda, the bars forged from fear, the locks made of your own need for belonging. This is the final, most disorienting truth. The cult of control has no power without your participation. Nietzsche called this the death of God. Not merely the fall of religion, but the collapse of all illusions that claim to give absolute meaning. The death of the corporate God is no different. Once you see the slogans as fabrications, the leaders as actors, the rituals as theater, their authority evaporates. The spell breaks. You realize the system is not an omnipotent force. It is a stage play that works only if the audience keeps clapping. And here lies both terror and liberation. Terror, because it means you have no excuse. You cannot blame the bars if they were made of air. Liberation, because it means the exit was always open. All along, you had the power to walk out, not necessarily from the job, but from the mental prison that made the job your identity. The ultimate truth is not that power controls you, but that you allow yourself to be controlled when you forget your own authorship of meaning.
Schopenhauer would phrase it differently. Life will always bring suffering, but enslavement is the choice to add unnecessary chains. Sartre sharpened it further. Man is condemned to be free. The condemnation is that you cannot escape responsibility. You are always choosing, even when you pretend you are not. To stay in the system unquestioningly is a choice. To rebel is a choice. To invent new values is a choice. You are never as powerless as you have been led to believe. And yet, this freedom is frightening. To live without the ready-made meanings corporations, cults, and systems hand you is to stand in a void. Camus called it the absurd, the realization that life itself offers no inherent script. But where others saw despair, Camus saw rebellion, the ability to embrace the absurd and create meaning anyway. His Sisyphus pushes the boulder endlessly, yet smiles, because he understands that the meaning of the task lies not in divine decree, but in his own embrace of it. So too can you embrace life outside the cult of control. You can work, create, love, suffer, and still remain free, so long as you never surrender the authorship of meaning to another's script. The CEO, the preacher, the politician, they may all attempt to hand you a ready-made narrative. The ultimate act of freedom is to smile, take what resonates, and discard the rest, never forgetting that you are the one holding the pen.